episode number 225 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. When you started on the fertility journey, you may have found that you went into hyper research mode and looked up every single possible thing you can do in order to improve your chances of conceiving. As an acupuncturist specializing in fertility, I love the compliance that I get from my patients because they are so engaged and willing to work with me. That being said, I've also seen some common mistakes people made, and I wanted to address them on this episode, so stay tuned. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. On today's episode, I'm going to share with you 5 mistakes that I've witnessed many of my patients and clients make when they're on the fertility journey. I'm going to share with you why I think they're mistakes and why they can actually work against your fertility goals. So let's begin. The first mistake I see, and it's probably the most frequent, is falling into this trap of being perfect in order to conceive. So can you guess what kind of person usually falls into this trap? And I'm speaking from experience. Overachievers. So I myself am an overachiever. When I get into something and I have a goal, I want to look at every single avenue. And that is usually what happens with overachievers. And especially when you have such a big motivation as starting your family. For women, it's also very primal because women do carry babies. There is almost a biological primal need or feeling that you really feel pulled to do. Overachievers get a lot of stuff done. And it's really worked a lot in my life, and it can work a lot in your life as well. It's not a bad trait to have. The only issue is when it is not balanced out, when it's too much of going after it and not being receptive. That is when things can go too stressful. So when it comes to reproductive health, when it comes to really Chinese medicine, and I've talked a lot about this, is that it all comes down to balance. So balance is not just important physically, but it's also important mentally. When you're go, 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 you're going to find that you're just going to get depleted. And this is with anything. Forget the subject matter. It could be on anything. When you overdo anything, you're going to eventually create imbalance because we're not supposed to overdo. We're supposed to have a good amount of doing and also a good amount of rest and receiving. So it's kind of like the active activity, which is the yang energy, and then the yin, which is receiving. And I've done an earlier podcast about the yin and the yang. So everything really comes to balance, and Chinese medicine is based on the Tao, which is all about the way. And that is really because when you find yourself living in accordance to the Tao and the way, you're living in a state of balance. And when you have too much of one extreme, it is going to throw you out of balance. So there's nothing wrong with looking into it and researching. What happens is when people research this and they want to make sure that they get every single box checked, and when that happens, it starts to become a chore. It starts to become stressful. And it creates dis-ease in the journey. And it could be detrimental because it can cause more stress. Stress can impact your hormones, your well-being, your sleep. So stress is just not a great thing in general. Forget just with fertility, but in general, it's not a great thing. And I'm talking about chronic stress. Everybody has a normal amount of stress, but I'm talking about chronic stress. Usually that happens when you're trying to be perfect or you're trying to achieve something that is not realistic. So you're really running against yourself. And it's important to know your limits and to honor those limits and to find a place where you feel at ease in the journey. I can reassure you, you can actually find ease in the journey. And I see people go through all the different phases, starting out with trying to be perfect, then getting to this point where they realize this is just not sustainable. Sometimes what that causes is the opposite effect. They'll start to eat whatever. They'll just completely like not want to do anything for a while because it's so hard to sustain. And then they go to the opposite extreme of drinking, eating whatever they want, and then they go back again to the middle ground. And that's usually when they find their flow and surrender through the fertility journey. And that is the sweet spot. It's kind of like doing, but also not doing at the same time, having that activity, but also trust. That combination is possible, even though it feels impossible, it is actually possible. So giving yourself an impossible goal to reach is not doable. And it's important to realize that you cannot be perfect. Nobody is born a unicorn, and there is no such thing. So when you realize that, just that realization alone takes the weight off your shoulders. So that's one big, huge stressor. And I will say it is important to really give yourself that self-compassion and ease by realizing that you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to get everything right 100% of the time. It's just not going to happen. It's more really that you want to start taking care of yourself and come at it from a place of that rather than expecting perfection from yourself, because it just doesn't exist. So, number 2 is self-diagnosing. So people going through Dr. Google and they start to find out different stories and they start to self-diagnose. That could be really dangerous. It could be a trap because you might end up giving yourself a diagnosis or using supplements that are not really meant for your body type or your body condition. You might end up doing a fad diet. You might end up thinking that you have something that is completely off base. And it's really important to make sure that you go to a doctor if you do suspect you have something. And I would say go to a reproductive endocrinologist over an OBGYN, because OBGYNs do understand fertility as one of the general things, but they do not specialize specifically with that because they have other things that they look into. Reproductive endocrinologists, that is what they specialize for. And they are really great at understanding and diagnosing. Knowing that, that is actually something that you should look into, because they will look for the right thyroid panel. They'll look more specifically and with greater discernment to see like what's going on with your body and what kind of conditions you have that can cause fertility challenges. A common reason that a lot of people don't want to go to reproductive endocrinologists is because they're like, I'm not interested in doing IVF. They're going to try to get me to do IVF. If you know that that is the way they're trained, they're going to look at ART methods to help you, and they may suggest that. Keep that in the back of your mind. You're not really interested. You kind of take that part of the going to them with a grain of salt, and then go to them to really get the diagnosis, which they can really help a lot with. And then you can also see other endocrinologists and get a couple of different opinions to make sure that many different perspectives look on your diagnosis, because everybody has a different perspective and mind and opinions. So it is important to get multiple opinions because you will get a more clear picture of what's going on. And trust yourself. You can handle them suggesting something that is not aligned with you and that you can choose to not do. So it's just important to get that perspective and to make sure that you know what your diagnosis is from a qualified doctor to tell you, like, really, this is what it is. We looked into it. We did the proper tests and so on. So mistake number 3 is comparison. We all fall into this trap. We compare ourselves with what is happening to us versus what is happening to somebody else. So for example, one of your friends can go for a couple of months with challenges trying to conceive, and you feel like you're on the same boat, but then they get pregnant faster, and then you're wondering, why did my friend get pregnant faster when I'm still going through this? And all it does is it really can cause a lot of emotions and frustration, and that's not going to help you. It's not going to help you figure out what's going on with you and what it is that you need to do. And then you might compare, somebody drinks and they get pregnant and I can't drink, and everybody's different. Everybody, like their bodies are different. Some people are more sensitive to some things and some are less sensitive to others. Meet yourself where you're at. Do not compare with other people. Also, what works for one person, diet, supplements, it could be very different for you. So it's important to meet yourself where you're at and customize for yourself so that you are not comparing, because when you do that, it can really mess with your mind and it's just not going to be helpful on your journey. So I definitely say do not compare, because you really are your own person, you're unique, and you deserve just as much honoring on your own journey and choices that are specifically customized to your own journey than someone else. So on to mistake number 4. Mistake number 4 kind of fits into the first mistake, which is trying to be perfect, because people get all of the different checks on the boxes and everything gets done. And what they forget about is self-care, self-compassion. So really going back to the basics and taking care of yourself. And what happens is when you try to be perfect and you forget about self-care, it becomes like a chore. But if you really put self-care number 1 on the list, then you're actually going to want to eat healthier. You're going to want to do good things for yourself, but it's going to come from a place of self-love and self-care rather than this demand that you're putting on yourself. So many times I see people like really not putting that as a priority. And I see my patients. I mean, it's almost like there's stages to fertility challenges. There's stages really, and it's not the fertility challenges, it's really the mindset of them. There are stages, just like stages of grief. There's different stages that I see, and some of them, if they get too perfect and trying to get everything done, then they get so frustrated, they go the opposite direction. Then they finally realize, I want to just care for myself because I need it. And they finally come back to themselves. When they finally do, that's when they start to do things not just for the end goal. They look at the journey there every single day. And that's a lot of times when they feel peace in their journey and they feel more at ease in their journey and are surprised by it, because they're like, I didn't know that I can actually feel at ease in the fertility journey. But yes, I could tell you and I can assure you, you can actually get to a place where you feel peace on your fertility journey before having the baby. That is absolutely possible, because I've seen it happen so many times, but it feels impossible as well. And it's not something that you have to force on yourself as another added pressure. It will happen in its due time. The important thing is that you give yourself that self-care and do things that make you feel joyous. So things that make you feel happy. Give yourself mental breaks. Give yourself permission to forget that you're on the fertility journey sometimes. Something as simple as that. Going dancing or putting music on, pretending you're in a completely different life through visualizations. Things like that, honestly, can work wonders for your life. So that is something that I definitely suggest doing, is putting yourself first, putting your self-care as number 1 on the list. That is more important than getting all the food right, all the right, seeing all the right practitioners, getting acupuncture. All of those things don't matter if you don't have the self-care as number 1, because that should be the foundation that everything else sits upon. And that will make a big difference in your fertility journey. So, on to mistake number 5. Mistake number 5 is not acknowledging that you have something called intuition. So remember when I talked about balance, we have our analytical side where we are able to look at numbers. We can get really lost if we go too far on that side, in the numbers, in the diagnosis, in the information, and we can almost lose our own center and self. And I see this happening a lot when people get into the whole clinical aspect and lose themselves. If they don't ground themselves, it could be very hard. But if you ground yourself and give yourself time to connect with your intuition, then it can actually help, because it'll also help you look and find the right practitioner, right doctors, and a lot of people may not realize that they have this amazing, beautiful ability called intuition. And animals have instinct. They can sense danger. We can sense things too. We are animals. So this is something that you have to remind yourself. We have these, and almost all people can look back at one point in their life and remember when they intuitively felt like something was either off or they felt guided to do something and they didn't listen. You'll always remember the time you didn't listen. And you didn't have this intuition because of an assessment that you made or for some obvious reason that you could have calculated. It wasn't anything that you could have known logically. It was all a matter of just knowing. It just kind of came to you and you felt like this knowing, but maybe your analytical mind said, well, that's not based on reality. That's really not based on anything. So you ignored that feeling and you go on doing something completely different. And then you look back and you're like, I should have listened to myself. I knew it, but I just totally ignored it. We've done this on tests when we take tests and we just know the answer. And even if it's like an answer that we didn't know from studying, it was just like a gut feeling that something's an answer and it wasn't something that you remembered to study. But then we don't answer that and then we find out, oh, I should have listened to myself. Like I knew it somewhere inside of me. So that's the intuition, and it's like this internal compass and guidance that tells you sense of information that's beyond chance, beyond logic. It's something that is a little bit more mysterious, and many of us, because we cannot prove it, think it doesn't exist. So when you don't acknowledge it, you're kind of leaving money on the table. Money meaning you're not using your full assets or your potential. And it's really important to know that you have it so that you can actually use it. And some of the ways that you can get into this intuition is through meditation. Practices like meditation, the reason why is because you get quiet and you can start to understand your internal awareness or your internal terrain. You have a whole other world inside your mind that you rarely pay attention to, except for maybe remembering some dreams or something like that. Most of the time, you're so distracted by the external material world that you don't really spend a lot of time in this aspect of yourself. When you do, when you spend a little more time doing that, even when you walk in nature, you'll get more in tune with that, even though you're not actually meditating. It'll create a sense or a state where you are a little bit more connected with yourself, because we are nature and nature knows how to tune us and get us back to that balance. That's why people feel more at ease when they're looking at the ocean or they're walking outside or smelling the fresh air or listening to the birds. There's a reason for that. It's because it tunes you, it gets you back to yourself. And what gets us out of ourselves is just too much information, too much analyzing. All of those things take us out of our center, our heart. And our heart knows. It's kind of like this just deep intuition, this deep sense. I've heard of people knowing intuitively that something was off with their body and then really being adamant about getting certain testing that they were dismissed about with doctors saying, oh, it's nothing. It turned out that it was something. Now, this is something different than self-diagnosis because they actually went and checked and got the diagnosis, and that diagnosis confirmed something that they knew within their hearts. So it is really important to connect. And so these are stories. These are actual stories that I've seen with my patients that felt completely unheard and eventually found that they were in fact correct. And that's why I think it's really important to be connected to that intuition, self-advocate, and get multiple opinions. These are really important things. But listening to that intuition, knowing, really connecting with that, you can get connected with that through, like I said, meditation, walking in nature, also listening to calming music, or even journaling, because it does get into the subconscious mind, and asking questions, or even asking signs, asking to be guided. And that is where you will start to feel signs. I love hearing my patient stories because I hear so many crazy mystical things, and they only happen when people are open to them. That's free will, I guess. When you're open to them, that's when you start receiving them. So it is something that I've noticed just over time, and I'll definitely, I am working on a book. I will definitely be putting a lot of these things in the book because, these are things that I notice and witness about watching people and observing and talking to people, is that there are certain patterns that start to happen, and it usually happens when a person wants them to happen or they're open for them to happen. So getting that guidance usually happens when you're open to it. If you are too much in doubt, you're blocking it. It's not that it doesn't happen to you or you're not special for it to happen. It's just that you're blocking it from happening. That doubt it's like putting your hand up and not allowing it to come in. So just the allowing or the listening is where you're opening that dialogue with your intuition. I hope that makes sense. So those are the mistakes that I see. And the reason why I want to talk about this is just really to empower you on your journey and to bring more awareness, because I think that awareness is really where it's at. Once you start to become aware, that's when you open yourself up to realizations and really connecting with that guidance within yourself, trusting yourself, putting yourself first. All of those things make a huge difference on your fertility journey. So I hope that this brought some clarity to your journey and some empowerment to your journey. And thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a beautiful day. So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.